There's a version of childhood that doesn't get talked about very much. It doesn't look like a bad childhood from the outside. The house was standing. There was food. School happened. Birthdays were marked in some way. But inside that house, a child was doing something they shouldn't have had to do. They were managing the emotional temperature of the adults around them. They were making themselves smaller so there would be more room for everyone else's needs. They were listening at doors, reading faces, calculating what mood the house was in before they said a single word. They were, in every meaningful sense, the grown-up in rooms where grown-ups should have been, and no one called it what it was. Because from the outside, it looked like a mature child, a responsible child, a good child. What it actually was a childhood that got skipped. Today, we're looking at 10 signs that you were forced to grow up too fast. Signs that live not in your memories of what happened, but in the patterns you still carry now, in adulthood, long after the house you grew up in stopped being your responsibility. Because the children who had to become adults too soon don't always know that's what happened to them. They just know that being young never felt like something they were allowed to be. Psychologists use two terms to describe what happens when children are given adult responsibilities before they are developmentally ready for them. The first is parentification, when a child takes on the emotional or practical role of a parent within the family. This can look like a child who becomes the therapist their parent never had, who mediates their parents' conflicts, who manages the household while a parent is unavailable through illness, addiction, or simply absence. The child becomes, in effect, the adult that the adults couldn't be. The second is adultification, a related but distinct concept, referring more broadly to children who are treated as older than they are, expected to handle things beyond their developmental capacity, denied the protections and the freedoms that childhood is supposed to provide. Both produce adults who carry a very specific kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who has been responsible for too much, for too long, starting far too early. Adults who are extraordinarily capable on the outside and who have, somewhere inside them, a child who never got to be one. Let's look at what that produces. Sign 1. You became the emotional caretaker of your parent. You knew things about your parents that children shouldn't know, not because they told you directly, though sometimes they did, but because you were the one they turned to, the one who sat with them when they were sad, the one who made them feel better when they were angry, the one whose job it was, somehow, without anyone saying so, to manage the emotional state of the person who was supposed to be managing yours. This looks from the outside like being a caring child, like having a close relationship with your parents, like emotional maturity. But there is a name for what this actually is: emotional parentification, and the psychological literature on it is unambiguous about the cost. A child's nervous system is not designed to regulate an adult's emotions. When a child becomes responsible for a parent's emotional well-being, they pay for it. In chronic hypervigilance, in difficulty knowing what they themselves feel, in a profound discomfort with their own needs, because the child who learns to attune so completely to someone else's emotional state does so at the expense of attuning to their own. They become experts in other people's feelings. They remain strangers, in many ways, to their own. And they carry into adulthood the reflexive assumption that their job, in every relationship, is to make the other person okay, before they are allowed to consider whether they are okay themselves. Sign 2. You felt responsible for the mood of the whole house. Before you crossed the threshold of any room at home, you knew. You could feel it. The specific quality of the silence, the way the air sat differently when someone was angry, the sound of doors closing in particular ways that told you what kind of evening this was going to be. You developed, out of necessity, an extraordinarily refined emotional sensory system. Not because you were especially empathic by nature, though you may have been, but because reading the room was a survival skill. Knowing the weather before it arrived gave you time to adjust, to disappear, to become whoever the house needed you to be. On the surface, this looked like sensitivity, like perceptiveness, like a child who was unusually tuned in. What it actually was is a nervous system that had been trained through repeated experience to treat the emotional states of the adults around it as information that required constant monitoring and response, not optional information, required. The kind of information that, in the child's early experience, had real consequences when misread. This is why so many adults who grew up forced to grow up too fast find themselves, decades later, still reading the room everywhere they go, still scanning faces before they speak, still checking, automatically and exhaustingly, whether the emotional temperature of the space they're in is safe enough for them to simply exist in it. The monitoring never got an off switch because no one ever told the nervous system that it was safe to stop. Sign 3. You stopped asking for things because you already knew the answer. There was a period, maybe so early you can't locate it, when you stopped asking. Not because you stopped wanting things, but because you ran the calculation. You weighed the need against the cost of asking, the potential sigh, the look of being burdened, the way the room might change if you introduced your need into it. And you decided, again and again, that the math didn't work out in favor of asking. So you learned to take care of your own needs quietly, to want less, at least visibly, to handle things yourself before they became visible, wants that required other people's resources to meet. This is a form of emotional self-sufficiency that gets praised as independence. And it is independent, technically. But independence that was born from learning that your needs were too much is not the same as independence that was chosen. The child who stops asking learns something that is very hard to unlearn, that their needs are a burden. The taking up space in someone else's resources is an imposition. That the responsible thing, the good thing, the easy to be around thing, is to require as little as possible. And the adult they become has enormous difficulty asking for help, not because they don't need it, because they learned very early that needing was already the first step toward the answer being no. Sign 4. You became the responsible one before you had a choice. There's a specific way the identity of the responsible one gets formed in families where a child had to grow up too fast. It doesn't get chosen, it gets assigned, usually without discussion, sometimes without anyone noticing, to the child who showed the most capacity for it, the one who could be relied upon, who didn't break down, who held things together, and once it was assigned, it became load-bearing. The family needed it to stay, so the child kept it. On the surface, this looks like a character trait, like simply being who you are, the dependable one, the organized one, the one everyone calls when something goes wrong. But there is an important question underneath it. Did you choose this? Or did you become it because the alternative, releasing the responsibility, being the one who was taken care of instead of taking care, wasn't available to you? There is nothing wrong with being responsible. The problem is the absence of the choice. A character that was built from necessity rather than election carries a weight that character built from genuine choice doesn't. Because inside the responsible adult is a child who was never asked whether they wanted the job, who was given it because they were the most capable of handling it, and who has been handling it ever since, not entirely sure they're allowed to stop. Sign 5. You grew up feeling like a burden when you needed something. In many families where a child is forced to grow up too fast, there is an asymmetry that becomes deeply embedded. Giving is safe and needing is dangerous. When you were useful, when you helped, when you contributed, when you solved something, the attention you received was warm, you fit, you were easy. You were in the specific language that gets under a child's skin and stays good. When you needed something, when you were sick or scared or simply wanted more than you were getting, something different happened. Maybe it was explicit, the sigh, the comment, the reminder of how much was already being managed without your needs added to the pile. Maybe it was implicit, the emotional withdrawal, the way the room changed when you took up too much space. Either way, the child drew a conclusion that was entirely rational given the data available to them. Being okay is welcome here. Needing is not. That conclusion becomes the blueprint. The adult who carries it is extraordinarily skilled at giving, to a fault, often to the point of depletion, and extraordinarily uncomfortable receiving. Not because they are noble and selfless, though they may be, but because their nervous system was trained to experience need as an imposition and giving as the price of being welcome. Flow. Sign 6. You struggle to play, rest, or do things with no purpose. What did you do as a child just for the pleasure of it? It's worth sitting with that question, because for many people who grew up too fast, the answer is harder to locate than it should be. Play, unstructured, purposeless, absorbed, requires a specific kind of permission. The permission to not be useful. The permission to exist in time that produces nothing. For children who grew up in environments that required their constant contribution, emotional, practical, or both, that permission was rarely granted. Time had to be earned through responsibility. Rest came after everything was handled. Play was something other children seemed to have access to in a way that felt slightly foreign. The adult who grew up this way doesn't know how to do nothing, not in a productive way, in a genuinely anxious way. Leisure produces discomfort. Weekends with no agenda create a low-grade unease that is hard to name. Rest feels like laziness, even when they're exhausted. The pleasure of purposelessness, which is one of the great restoratives of the human nervous system, is not something they have clean access to. Because somewhere, the lesson was learned. Your right to exist in space and time is contingent on your usefulness within it, and that lesson is still running. Sign 7. You have an overdeveloped radar for others, and an underdeveloped one for yourself. Ask yourself something honestly. If a close friend is upset, how quickly do you know? Most people who grew up forced to grow up too fast can answer that immediately and precisely. They notice the tone shift, the micro-expression, the barely perceptible withdrawal. They've been trained to read people with a precision that approaches the uncanny. And they've been trained since early childhood, when accurate emotional reading was not a skill, but a requirement. Now ask yourself the other question. If you yourself are upset, how quickly do you know? That answer is usually much slower, murkier, sometimes not available at all until the feeling has been present for quite a while, sometimes not until it arrives as a physical symptom or a behavioral change that someone else notices before you do. The asymmetry is not accidental. When a child's emotional attention is directed primarily outward toward the adults who need managing, the atmosphere that needs monitoring, the attention available for inward sensing is diminished. The skill for reading others was developed because it was required. The skill for reading yourself was never given the same practice, the same priority, the same permission. You became a specialist in other people. You remained, in some essential way, a beginner in yourself. Sign 8. You were praised for being so mature, and it never felt like a compliment. Adults said it regularly. So mature, so responsible, so easy to have around. And you learned to accept it as praise, to nod and receive it as something positive, because that was clearly how it was intended. But there was always something underneath the receiving. A small, unclear discomfort that you couldn't quite name at the time and may still find difficult to articulate. Here is what that discomfort was saying. You were being praised for having successfully hidden your age, for performing adulthood convincingly enough that no one needed to account for the fact that you were still a child. The maturity wasn't being praised as an achievement. It was being praised as a convenience. It made the adults around you more comfortable. It required less from them. It meant they could rely on you in ways that saved them work. There was nothing wrong with you being praised. But the praise was for the wrong thing. It was for the adaptation, not for you. For the armor, not for the person inside it. And the child who learns that you're so mature is the highest form of approval available develops a complicated relationship with the parts of themselves that are not mature. The parts that need, or want, or struggle, or simply want to be young. Those parts learn to stay out of sight, because the only version of them that got praised was the one who had already figured it out. Sign 9. You have a complicated relationship with needing help. You know how to give help. Genuinely, practically, thoroughly. You're good at it. You've had a lifetime of practice, and you give it in a way that other people can feel. Asking for it is a different country entirely. Not because you don't know you need it sometimes, but because the act of asking carries a specific weight that most people don't have to carry. The anticipation of being a burden. The sense that your need is an imposition on whoever is receiving it. The fear, usually not conscious but felt in the body, that asking will change how someone sees you, that it will reduce your standing, that it will make you less easy to be around, less valuable, less welcome. This is the direct inheritance of a childhood in which your value was tied to your contribution, and your needs were the thing that made you a problem. The sophisticated adults you may have seen in therapy or read about, who can ask for help cleanly, who can receive care without making it small, who can be in need without shame, seem to possess something that doesn't feel genetically available to you. Like they grew up with a different operating system. They may have. They may have grown up in a house where need was not a deduction from worth, where asking was met with of course, rather than a sigh. Where they learned through early and consistent experience that being helped was simply what happened when you needed something. You learned something different, and the unlearning is hard, real, and genuinely worth doing. Sign 10. Part of you is still waiting for the childhood you didn't get. This one is the quietest sign, and maybe the most important. Somewhere, not always consciously, there's a part of you that knows something was missed. Not a specific event, though there may be those too, but a quality of time. A way of being in the world that other children seem to have access to, that was not quite available to you. The freedom to be young, to be taken care of without it being unusual. To have your needs met as a matter of course, rather than as a negotiation. To be the child, definitively and completely, rather than the child who is also something else. This longing doesn't always arrive as sadness. Sometimes it arrives as a strange sense of recognition when you see children being genuinely, freely, uninhibitedly young, a recognition that is warm and slightly aching at the same time. Sometimes it arrives as an unexpected grief when something small is offered to you with genuine, uncomplicated care. Sometimes it arrives simply as a quiet, pervasive sense that you missed something you can't quite name. You are allowed to grieve it. The childhood you didn't have was real in its absence. The things you missed were real losses. And the fact that no one meant to hurt you, that the circumstances were what they were, that people did the best they could, none of that makes the loss smaller. It just makes it more complicated. Grief doesn't require a villain. It requires only a real loss. And this was one. 10 signs. None of them visible from the outside. None of them things anyone pointed to and said, "This is costing you something." They were praised. They were called strengths. They were the things that made you easy to be around and easy to rely on and easy to love in the conditional way that was available in the environment you grew up in. I want to say something very clearly about all of it. You didn't grow up too fast because you were strong. You grew up too fast because no one protected your right to be young. Those are not the same thing, and the distance between them matters, because one is a fact about you and one is a fact about what your environment failed to provide. The maturity that was praised in you was not a quality that emerged naturally. It was an adaptation, a remarkably effective one. You are here. You are functional. You have built a life. But an adaptation nonetheless. Built not from choice, but from necessity. And adaptations built from necessity, rather than chosen, carry a kind of tiredness that chosen ones don't. The child who had to carry everything, who learned to read every room, who stopped asking, who took care of everyone else first, they deserve, finally, to set some of it down. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the small, incremental ways that real change happens, noticing the need before dismissing it, asking the question before assuming the answer is no, resting for one moment without calculating whether the rest was earned. You have been responsible for so much, for so long. You were given that role before you were old enough to choose it or refuse it. You are old enough now, and what you do with that is yours to decide. If this video named something, share it with someone who might recognize themselves in it. Sometimes the most useful thing one person can offer another is the language for something they've been carrying without a name. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.